Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's a really great pleasure and privilege to have as our guest today our friend Ray Wong. Welcome, Ray. Ray is the first activist from Hong Kong to be granted asylum several years ago in Germany. He was the co-founder of the influential group Hong Kong Indigenous, founded in 2015, which of course was responsible for the slogan that everybody knows now and which is now banned in Hong Kong, Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times. Ray, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. Um, Ray, perhaps I could start by just asking you, when you first started out in the fight for freedom some years ago and you founded Hong Kong Indigenous, what were your goals then, and what would you say are your goals now?
Well, so my start of being an activist has a lot to do with the umbrella revolutions in 2014. At that time, I, along with other young protesters whom I get to know during the umbrella revolution, thought that there are not many Hong Kong really realize the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, and we believe the one country, two systems is not sufficient to protect our basic rights and freedom. And at that time, we also believe that the Chinese government would not really allow the democratizations in Hong Kong. So one of our main objectives is a rather defensive approach. We wanted to protect our unique culture, our language, and our Hong Kong identity. It was our main objective, but I would say after the anti-extradition law movement in 2019, the majority of Hong Kong people, especially the pro-democracy side, have already become aware of the interference from Beijing, and they realize the importance of preserving our identity. Now my objective has slightly shifted to the protection of our human rights, and also to raise awareness of the in Germany or in the whole EU on the human rights situations in Hong Kong.
Thank you. Could you tell us, as I said when I introduced you, you were the first Hong Konger to seek and to secure asylum. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, why you sought asylum? Because that was before the national security law, before the
Right.
severe crackdown that we've seen in the last 1 or 2 years. What was the reason you left Hong Kong, and what was the experience of becoming a refugee?
Yeah. Well, long story short, I was arrested in February 2016 because of the so-called fishbowl revolutions, and I was charged with inciting a riot, participating in a riot, and inciting an illegal assembly. All these three charges are actually from an outdated colonial law called Public Order Ordinance, which was criticized by the UN Human Rights Commission. yeah, after the arrest, I got bailed with huge amounts of bail money. And actually the court also confiscated my passport. And at that time, I actually didn't plan to flee Hong Kong. I was thinking, well, I would stand the trial. I may be imprisoned for 6 to 10 years. I was ready for that. But at that time, I also had discussions with my colleagues at Learn and also other members from Hong Kong Indigenous. We thought that it might not be wise if everyone goes to the prisons. Someone should flee to tell our story, to raise awareness internationally. And at that point, I thought, well, as Edwards is more presentable and his English is much better than mine at that time, I thought Edward is the right candidate to leave Hong Kong, and I would stay in Hong Kong, serve the sentence, and then, yeah, we will see. But things change very quickly. We got banned from participating in the elections, in the general election in 2016. We support the other party. We also got banned, got disqualified, and the whole localist movement got to a state where we didn't really have any rooms to advocacy work, and we were oppressed to a very serious extent. We, as for example, my personal security was threatened by Chinese agents, and also my mom was threatened by Chinese agents, and some of our members would regularly be followed by some suspicious, maybe Chinese or maybe Hong Kong police, we didn't know. And then in August, September 2017, Edward came back from the US after his study in Harvard. And he told me that he decided to stay in Hong Kong. And it was the moment I started to reconsider about my road, because as I said, I didn't plan to leave Hong Kong. But yeah, as Edward has made his own decisions, I start to think, okay, then should I leave or should I stay? And rationally speaking, I know that someone should leave to maybe at least to continue the movement in overseas. Yeah, it was a very struggling time for me, because on one hand, I know once I fled my city, I could no longer come back. I couldn't see my friends, couldn't hike, couldn't go to my favorite place on earth. But on the other hand, I know it's sort of my responsibility to continue the movement, and I was really struggling a lot. There were around 2 weeks I was in depression. I really couldn't eat, couldn't sleep for 2 weeks. After that, I knew that, okay, I shouldn't let myself be in this situations for so long. I have to make decisions to live. And then it was just after making the decisions, I immediately applied for my passport from the court, and then I needed to deal with a lot of stuff. I didn't really have enough time to say goodbye to my friends, and at that time I didn't know what would happen, so I actually didn't tell anyone. I just told my mom, and that's it. And I still remember the last day I was still in Hong Kong. I went for a hike with some friends, and yeah, that day was wonderful. but it was also unforgettable for me because I was having a really nice time with them while knowing that it might be the last time for us to hike together, and they didn't know. So yeah, this is the story. My story of fleeing my city, and why I chose Germany is actually the result of our considerations, because at that time I had three options. I first maybe the UK and Canada and Germany, but at that time the UK and Canada still had a pretty good relationship with China. It was just the end of 2017, still the end of golden era in the UK. So I was afraid that if I seek asylum in the UK, I might be deported back to Hong Kong. So in comparison to the UK, it's Germany outspoken in terms of the human rights situation in China. So I thought Germany might be the right place for me to try to seek asylum.
Thank you. I'll come back to you in a few moments on the question of Germany's relationship with China. But before I do, as the first Hong Konger to get asylum, since your case, and in the last year, of course, there have been many Hong Kongers who have left Hong Kong either to take up the UK's British National Overseas visa scheme, or to seek asylum in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, in other places. And of course, Canada and Australia also have lifeboat schemes. What would you, from your experience, what are your thoughts and your message to Hong Kongers now who are going down the same path that you took a few years ago?
Well, to me personally, there are two main difficulties as a refugees. I think the first is to integrate into a new culture, into a new society, while preserving the Hong Kong identity, because before my disclosure, basically no one knew I'm in Germany, and I haven't been in touch with any Hong Kong activists. So at that time, I had only German friends or international friends. I didn't have any Hong Kong friends. And yeah, when you are living in such an environment, it's very easy to distance yourself from all the Hong Kong affairs. I remember before the proposals of the anti-extradition law, I was reading news about Hong Kong maybe twice a day, once for 2-3 days, and I felt I was actually afraid that if I live in Germany and I keep distance from anything related to Hong Kong for too long, I would just give up my own Hong Kong identity, and then, yeah, just think Hong Kong affairs has no longer anything to do with me. But then but at that time I was aware that I will become an activist again. Now it's just a phrase for me to wait a right timing. But and then now, as I'm witnessing so many Hong Kong fleeing the city, and all of them are very keen to integrate into a new environment, I am actually a bit worried that as Hong Kong are so adaptable, it might be easy for them to basically give up the Hong Konger identity, and also they might not be keen to pass the Hong Konger identity to their next generations. And actually, we could see a lot of Hong Konger who fled Hong Kong in 80s, 90s, or after the June 4 massacre. Some of them, they didn't even speak Cantonese with their children at home. So some of the second generation Hong Konger in Canada couldn't speak Cantonese at all. They are completely Canadian, and this would be a difficulty. Is to me. I talked with the journalist this morning, and he also told me that the survivor guilt is very weird, and it actually distracts us to from being from having a healthy healthy mentality, because every day we witness some our fellow Hong Kong in prison, standing in trial. Some of them every day people get arrested, while we are in Europe, breathing free air and having, in comparison to them, a not bad life. Every time when we see the news, when we think about it, we would have a very strong sense of guilty, and it really took me 3 years to overcome it. I still remember. After moving out from the refugee camps, I moved in shared flats with a group of young people, and sometimes we would have parties. But in that period, every time when I was having party with them, when I start to feel relaxed or start to feel happy, that sense of guilt just haunts me immediately. And there is another voice in my mind telling me that you are not supposed to feel happy. You don't deserve any pleasure, because why you are free here is because of your responsibility, because some people are serving their sentence for you. So you don't deserve it. And it really halted me for a very long time. And by time, the longer you deprive yourself from any happiness, the worse your mental conditions will get. And it actually won't benefit you to fulfill your responsibility, because as you are not in a good shape, how could you do your work properly? And how and I'm sure people in prisons, people on the ground, they also don't want us to suffer. They also want us to have a normal life, but at the same time, we could do whatever we could in our positions. And yeah, maintaining our own health is actually the responsibility of Hong Kong for the future development, for this long-term fight. So I would say these two are the main difficulties for being a refugee.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's extremely profound and very moving. Can I ask you? You mentioned Germany and its relationship with China, and the fact that at the time that you went there, it was more outspoken. Germany has just had elections. It's in the process of trying to form a new government as a result of the elections. How do you see Germany's relationship with China, its position in regard to human rights in China and Hong Kong currently, and what do you think the new government's position is likely to be?
Yeah, if I were to conclude the current German China policy, I think the Wandel durch Handel, the German phrase called meaning transformation is the key word here, and Angela Merkel and her party CDU-CSU are still holding the belief that in engaging with authoritarian regimes, they should not give up on the engagement policy, because back in the Cold War time, this is actually their strategy on the playbook, and it played well. That's why they still stick to this strategy. But as we have seen, China has learned from the mistake of from Soviet Union, and China now is more advanced authoritarian regimes. So a lot of Chinese experts here in Germany, and also some other parties, including the FDP and the Greens, demand a new China policy. And so after the elections, now the most likely coalitions would be what we call traffic light coalitions. These coalitions consist of SPD, FDP, and the Greens. So the Merkel's party is not included in the new government, which already is a good sign, given what I've just said. So SPD, FDP, and the Greens, two of them are very China critical, and as Hong Kong Watch has been cooperating with MPs from the FDP, for example, Gerda Jensen, she was the chair of the Human Rights Committee in the Bundestag, and also MPs from the Greens, Margarete Bauser, but unfortunately she isn't elected in the new Bundestag, but we could see FDP and the Greens are very reliable allies for Hong Kong, also the other minorities oppressed by the Chinese government. And SPD in this regard has been a bit ambivalent, because on one hand they traditionally pro left-leaning government, so they also have sympathy to Russia, to China. But last year, actually, SPD published new China policy white paper, in which they stated clearly that it's time for Germany to change its China policy, but it doesn't state what change they are expecting or what change they propose. So this is something we still don't know. But now the negotiations between these three parties is still going on. We could probably expect to know more in the next month, because the negotiations for the traffic light coalition just started 1 week ago, and now they are talking more about domestic issue, for example, whether they should increase tax, whether they should impose speed limits on German highway, and cannabis legalization, this issue. And there is still no news as to what how the new China policy would look like. But as these three parties have been very concerned about the Europe, I think we could expect something next month. And my guess would be in human rights violations, Germany would definitely be more outspoken in comparisons to Merkel's government. But to what extent the German government would really employ substantial policy to counter or to hold China accountable for its human rights violations. These questions remain uncertain because for every European member state, they have especially for Germany, they have the policy to practice this kind of sanctioning policy at the EU level. So when it comes to EU, the things get even more complicated. And so, yeah, that's the overview of the potential change of German-China policy.
Thank you. You mentioned that when you sought asylum in Germany, Germany's position was stronger than the UK or Canada's position in regard to China. And I remember Angela Merkel some years ago being quite outspoken, perhaps not taking much action, but at least speaking out very strongly and regularly on human rights in China. What do you think changed? Why do you think she changed her approach to China?
Well, I would say there are at least two reasons. The first is the increasing dependency of the German car industry on China's market, because I remember in 2017, 2018, Volkswagen, the most important market for Volkswagen become China's market, and also for other German car company. And as Volkswagen and other German cars company have great influence in German politics, and especially on CDU, CSU, I suspect that this is one of the reasons why the current German government suddenly changed their attitude on human rights violations in China. And the second reason, at this point, I'm also not very sure, but there are some experts associating the Trump's government with the change of the attitude of the German government, because Angela Merkel is also very well known anti-Trumper, and she some observers believe that EU and Merkel don't want to stand too close with Trump, and that's why when Trump deployed very hawkish China policy, Germany and EU were reluctant to follow.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you on the question of extradition, not the extradition bill in Hong Kong in 2019, but rather the fact that some European countries still have extradition agreements with Hong Kong and with China itself. What are the risks in real terms, do you think, for Hong Kong activists and indeed activists from mainland China in Europe, and what would be your message to those European countries that still have those agreements?
Well, I think it's really ridiculous that as is more than obvious, there is no fair trial there. The legal system, the judicial system in China is not really justice. It's ridiculous for so many European countries to have extradition treaties with such human rights violators country, for example, Belgium and Greece. Last week, one of our colleagues, Joey, was arrested in Greece. If China at that time suddenly announced that Zhou Yi is a wanted person under a certain Chinese law, and the Chinese government requests the Greek government to extradite Zhou Yi, it might be a crisis for all the human rights activists, and Greece. So. To me personally, every time when I traveled to other European countries, I would first check whether they have the country has an extradition treaty with China and Hong Kong, and if they have a treaty, I would reconsider, or I may choose. I may be more low profiled when I am there. And I think every European country should reconsider whether they should keep this extradition treaty with such an authoritarian state, because we have witnessed more than enough cases that the Chinese government makes use of their laws to oppress dissidents and oppress their human rights oppress human rights activists. So the European countries shouldn't assist China to oppress dissidents.
I'd like to ask a penultimate question before we then conclude with a final question. The situation in Hong Kong in the last 1 year, especially since the national security law, has deteriorated probably more than anyone expected, and certainly much more than it was the situation when you founded Hong Kong Indigenous and then when you left Hong Kong. I mean, already then we could see some warning signs. We could see that Hong Kong's freedoms were being eroded, but they've been totally dismantled now in the last 1 year. What are your reflections on the situation in Hong Kong now, and what do you see as the future for Hong Kong?
So recently, I was reading a book called A Concise History of Hong Kong, and it was particularly shocking to me that actually during the negotiations of the Sino-British Joint Declarations and also the in the process of drafting the basic law, there were a lot of scholars and social critics were worried about the hangover, and at that time, a lot of people were already making a prognosis as to what will happen for the freedoms and rights in Hong Kong. And it's strikingly accurate, because what we have witnessed, I would say, in this decade was exactly expected by the observer at that time. So my question is, why at that time, even though so many observers, scholars already expected the failure of one country, two systems, why still some people Hong Kong were willing to trust this thuggish authoritarian state? It's not uncommon that the Chinese Communist Party lies to its people, lies to their partner, lies to other country. But why? Why do we still have trust in that? And I think my reflections now from the situation in Hong Kong is that Hong Kong at that time were too naive, and our judgment actually was rendered by Chinese nationalism. We naively believe that the Chinese government would eventually change its attitudes in human rights, and the Chinese government, as we all are still Chinese, wouldn't really treat us too bad, and at least would be better than the colonial government. And so now I always tell my friends here in Germany, and also with politicians, that Hong Kong have learned a very painful lessons in this 30 years, and the lesson is that we should not trust the Chinese Communist Party, and the Sino-British Joint Declarations and the situation in Hong Kong is the quintessence of the authoritarianism of the party, Chinese Communist Party.
And finally, what message would you want to give to people who are watching this interview, whether they are still in Hong Kong or around the world, or are friends of Hong Kong? What would be your message?
Well, I think now when we look at the future of Hong Kong, we would think it's very gloomy, it's very hopeless. But after coming to Germany, I have heard many stories from people who were living in East Germany, and other Soviet countries. They all told me that before the collapse of the Soviet Union, no one believed such things could really happen. But as we know already, it happened. So now we may think the CCP is very strong, very powerful. We are too powerless to fight against such regimes. But the lessons of the Soviet Union has taught us everything is possible as long as we remain hopeful and we still have faith.
That's a very good and true and positive message to end on. Ray Wong, it's been a pleasure to have you as our guest in this interview. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.